October 4th, 1982. Frank Rosenthal walked out of Tony Rama's restaurant on East Sahara Avenue in Las Vegas and approached his 1981 Cadillac Eldorado. It was a warm evening. He had just finished dinner. He got into the driver's seat, put his key in the ignition, and turned it. The car exploded. Fire engulfed the vehicle. The blast was so powerful it shattered windows in nearby buildings. Frank Rosenthal should have died instantly. But a metal plate under the driver's seat, installed by General Motors to balance the car's weight, deflected the explosion just enough to save his life. He crawled from the burning wreckage with minor burns and scratches, screaming, "They are trying to kill me." 3 weeks later, on November 9th, 1982, Geri McGee Rosenthal was found heavily drugged in the lobby of the Beverly Sunset Hotel in Los Angeles. She died 3 days later. The coroner ruled it an accidental overdose of cocaine, Valium, and whiskey. Her sister believes she was murdered by the same people who tried to kill Frank. Others thought Frank had her killed in retaliation. The truth died with her. 4 years later, on June 14th, 1986, Tony Spilotro and his brother Michael were lured to a meeting in Chicago. They were told Michael was being made and Tony was being promoted to capo. Instead, they were beaten to death in a basement in Bensonville, Illinois, and buried in an Indiana cornfield. A farmer found their bodies 9 days later, stacked on top of each other, wearing only their underwear. These are the real events that inspired Martin Scorsese's Casino. The movie showed you violence, betrayal, and tragedy. But the real story was darker, far darker. Because what happened in Las Vegas was not just about greed and crime. It was about systematic murder, torture, and the complete destruction of everyone involved. And tonight, we are going to tell you what the movie could not show. If you want the real story behind Casino, the murders the movie sanitized, the torture it could not depict, the truth that makes Scorsese's masterpiece look tame, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from and what time it is in your city. Are you watching this at 2 a.m. because true crime keeps you awake? Or are you binge watching during your break because you cannot get enough? Let us know. And if you love content that exposes the darkness Hollywood can only hint at, smash that like button and share this with someone who thinks Casino told the whole story. The Syndicate Files, where we reveal the truth that movies hide. Frank Rosenthal was not a typical mobster. Born June 12, 1929, in Chicago, Frank was a Jewish kid who grew up at racetracks with his father, who owned horses. Young Frank absorbed everything about gambling: odds, percentages, how to read players, how to identify patterns, how to exploit weaknesses in betting systems. By his teenage years, Rosenthal could calculate complex betting scenarios in his head faster than most professional bookmakers could with pencil and paper. Sports Illustrated would later call him the greatest living expert on sports gambling. He had a photographic memory for numbers and an almost supernatural ability to predict outcomes based on statistical analysis. But Rosenthal's genius came with serious risks. In 1963, he pleaded no contest to bribing a New York University player to shave points in a college basketball game. This was a major scandal that made national headlines. The conviction would haunt him for the rest of his life, making it impossible for him to ever obtain a legitimate gaming license in Nevada or anywhere else. But that criminal record also brought him to the attention of the Chicago outfit, the powerful organized crime family that controlled most illegal gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering throughout the Midwest. The outfit recognized that Rosenthal's gambling knowledge was worth millions of dollars. They did not need another thug with a gun. They had plenty of those. They needed someone who could make casinos profitable while simultaneously skimming millions in unreported cash. They needed Frank Rosenthal. In 1968, Rosenthal moved to Las Vegas to escape further police attention in Chicago. At age 40, he began working as a pit boss at the Stardust Casino. one of the largest hotels on the Las Vegas Strip. His exceptional gambling knowledge and his ability to spot card counters and cheaters quickly got him promoted to higher executive positions. By 1971, he was effectively running 4 major Las Vegas casinos owned by Argent Corporation: the Stardust, Fremont, Marina, and Hacienda. These casinos were not really owned by Argent. They were secretly controlled by the Chicago outfit, along with mob families from Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Cleveland, using Argent and a frontman named Alan Glick as cover to hide their true ownership. Frank Rosenthal ran these 4 casinos without a gaming license, which was completely illegal under Nevada law. The Nevada Gaming Control Board, led by future United States Senator Harry Reid, held hearings in 1976 to determine if Rosenthal could get a license. They denied him because of his 1963 arrest record and his documented friendship with Chicago enforcer Anthony Spilotro. But Rosenthal continued running the casinos anyway, officially working as an executive consultant to Alan Glick, while actually making every major decision about casino operations, staffing, entertainment, and most importantly, the flow of money. And Rosenthal was absolutely brilliant at casino management. He instituted policies and innovations that changed Las Vegas forever. He opened the first sports book inside a major casino, with comfortable leather seating, individual television sets for each bettor, and a sophisticated odds board that displayed lines for dozens of sporting events simultaneously. Before Rosenthal's innovation, all sports books were located off the Strip in dingy offices that felt more like back alley operations than legitimate businesses. Rosenthal made sports betting glamorous, turning it into a premium casino amenity that attracted high rollers from around the world. He also hired women as blackjack dealers, another absolute first in Las Vegas casino history. Before Rosenthal, every blackjack dealer in every major casino was male. Casino executives believed that only men had the mathematical skills and the authority to handle large amounts of money. Rosenthal proved them catastrophically wrong. His innovation of hiring attractive female dealers doubled the Stardust blackjack income in 1 year, because male gamblers enjoyed having beautiful women dealing cards and were more likely to stay at the tables longer, bet more money, and tip more generously. But Rosenthal's most important function, the real reason the mob valued him above almost everyone else in their Las Vegas operations, was overseeing the skim. The skim was money stolen from casino count rooms before it could be reported to the Internal Revenue Service. Mob chiefs from Chicago, Milwaukee, Cleveland, and Kansas City all had hidden ownership interests in these casinos, funneled through layers of front companies and corrupt union pension funds. They relied on Rosenthal to make sure they got their proper shares of unreported cash every single week without fail. Rosenthal hired a man named J. Vandermark to directly supervise the skimming operation. Vandermark developed a sophisticated scheme that involved rigging slot machine coin-weighing equipment to systematically undercount coins by small percentages, allowing millions of dollars to be siphoned off over time without triggering audits or investigations. The money was then distributed to mob bosses across the country through a complex network of couriers and intermediaries. By the mid-1970s, conservative estimates suggest that the Las Vegas skim was generating at least $10 million per year in unreported cash for organized crime families. Some investigators believe the real number was much higher. Rosenthal himself was earning approximately $250,000 per year in official salary as a consultant, plus whatever additional money he managed to skim for himself on the side. He had become the most powerful non-Italian mobster in Las Vegas. He lived in a palatial home. He drove expensive cars. He had connections at the highest levels of Nevada politics and law enforcement. But there was a serious problem brewing. The Chicago outfit did not just send Rosenthal to Las Vegas to make them money. They also sent an enforcer to protect him, intimidate anyone who threatened the operation, and make sure Rosenthal stayed in line and did not get too independent or greedy. That enforcer was Anthony Spilotro. And Tony Spilotro was about to turn Las Vegas into a bloodbath. Tony Spilotro was everything Frank Rosenthal was not. Born May 19, 1938, in Chicago, Tony came from a working-class Italian family that owned a restaurant which quickly became a hangout for local mobsters. By his early 20s, Spilotro had become a made man in the Chicago outfit through the most brutal violence imaginable. His mentor was Mad Sam DiStefano, one of the most sadistic and psychopathic killers in mob history. DiStefano was famous or infamous for torturing his victims for hours or even days before finally killing them. He would use ice picks, blowtorches, cattle prods, and other instruments of torture to extract information or simply to satisfy his own twisted pleasure in causing pain. Under DiStefano's guidance, young Tony Spilotro learned how to torture and murder without hesitation or remorse. In one of the most notorious cases, Spilotro and DiStefano kidnapped two thieves known as the M&M Boys, Billy McCarthy and Jimmy Miraglia, who had committed an unauthorized burglary in a territory controlled by the outfit. To get information about where they had hidden the stolen goods, Spilotro put Billy McCarthy's head in a bench vise and slowly tightened it. As the vise compressed McCarthy's skull, the pressure became so intense that his eyeball popped out of its socket. This horrific torture technique, which became known as the vice treatment, earned Spilotro his reputation as an enforcer who would do absolutely anything. McCarthy eventually talked, giving up the location of the stolen goods and the names of everyone involved. Then Spilotro and DiStefano killed both men and buried their bodies in a cornfield. In the early 1970s, the Chicago outfit sent Spilotro to Las Vegas with clear instructions: protect Frank Rosenthal, oversee the casino skim operation, and keep a low profile. But Tony Spilotro was psychologically incapable of keeping a low profile. Within months of arriving in Las Vegas, he had formed a burglary crew that would eventually be nicknamed the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang by law enforcement and the media. The gang's specialty was drilling holes through the walls or roofs of jewelry stores, electronic shops, and other businesses, then robbing them in the middle of the night when no one was around. The Hole-in-the-Wall Gang committed dozens of burglaries throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, but Spilotro was not satisfied with just his crew's operations. He declared himself the boss of all illegal activity in Las Vegas and demanded a percentage of every major robbery, burglary, or theft that occurred in the city, whether he participated or not. If other criminals wanted to operate in Las Vegas, they had to get permission from Tony Spilotro and pay him tribute. Those who refused found themselves beaten, tortured, or killed. Spilotro's violence was legendary and seemingly random. Law enforcement officials estimated that he was personally involved in at least 22 to 26 murders during his time in Las Vegas, though the real number could be much higher because many bodies were never found. After Spilotro's arrival in Las Vegas, the city's murder rate increased by 70%. Homicide detectives started seeing a pattern of particularly brutal killings, victims who had been tortured before death, bodies that were found dismembered or buried in the desert, people who simply vanished without a trace. Tony Spilotro was turning Las Vegas from a relatively safe tourist destination into a war zone. And the Chicago outfit bosses were starting to realize they had made a terrible mistake by sending him there. Then there was Geri McGee. Born May 16, 1936, in Los Angeles, Geri had a difficult childhood marked by poverty and instability. Her father worked multiple jobs at gas stations to support the family. Her mother was chronically ill with medical problems that kept her bedridden for long periods. By the time Geri reached high school, she was stunningly beautiful, tall, blonde, with perfect features that made her stand out in any crowd. She was classmates with future movie star Robert Redford and baseball legend Don Drysdale at Van Nuys High School. As a teenager, Geri began dating a hustler and small-time pimp named Lenny Marmer. When Geri became pregnant at age 20, Marmer convinced her to move to Las Vegas, where she could make money as a showgirl and cocktail waitress while he ran various schemes and scams. Geri gave birth to a daughter, Robin, in 1958. But Marmer was a terrible father and an even worse partner. He would disappear for weeks at a time, then show up demanding money that Geri had earned through her own work. Geri McGee was far more than just a pretty face working in casinos. She was intelligent, resourceful, and a natural hustler who quickly learned how Las Vegas really worked. Her job as a cocktail waitress and occasional showgirl gave her access to high-rolling gamblers from around the world. She developed a technique where she would approach wealthy men at the gambling tables, charm them with conversation and attention, and convince them to give her chips as gifts. She would then cash in those chips and keep the money. By the time Frank Rosenthal met her in the late 1960s, Geri had earned enough money through this hustle to buy her own house in Las Vegas and support not just her daughter, but also her sick mother, her sister, and her nephews. She was fiercely independent, street smart, and completely unprepared for what marrying Frank Rosenthal would bring into her life. Frank Rosenthal fell for Geri instantly and completely. She represented everything he wanted: beauty, charm, a woman who understood the gambling world and could hold her own in conversations with high rollers and celebrities. They married on May 4th, 1969, in a ceremony that was attended by many of Las Vegas's most powerful figures. They soon had 2 children, Stephen, born in 1970, and Stephanie, born in 1971. For a few years, it looked like Frank had achieved the American dream: a beautiful wife, 2 healthy children, enormous wealth, and more power than most legitimate businessmen could ever hope to achieve. But the marriage was doomed from the beginning. Frank expected Geri to be a traditional 1950s-style housewife, staying home to raise the children while he worked 18-hour days running casinos and mob operations. Geri, who had been independent for years and was used to the excitement of the Las Vegas nightlife, absolutely hated domestic life. She felt trapped, bored, and resentful. She began going out at night without Frank, drinking heavily in casinos and nightclubs, and having affairs with other men. Frank's response was to become more controlling, which only made Geri more rebellious. The marriage spiraled into a toxic cycle of infidelity, accusations, reconciliations, and more infidelity. And one of those affairs was with Tony Spilotro, Frank Rosenthal's best friend, his protector, and the man the Chicago outfit had sent to Las Vegas specifically to keep Frank safe. This affair would set in motion a chain of events that would destroy everyone involved. What the movie Casino depicts as Ginger's passionate affair with Lester Diamond, a smooth-talking hustler played by James Woods, was actually far more complicated and far darker in real life. Geri McGee did have an ongoing relationship with Lenny Marmer, her high school boyfriend and the father of her daughter Robin. Marmer would periodically visit Las Vegas, usually when he needed money, and Geri would almost always give it to him despite Frank's objections. This infuriated Frank, who saw Marmer as a parasite and a lowlife who was taking advantage of Geri's misplaced loyalty and guilt about their daughter. But the real betrayal, the one that would eventually contribute to Frank Rosenthal's car bombing and the collapse of the entire Las Vegas mob operation, was Geri's sexual affair with Tony Spilotro. The exact timeline of when Geri and Tony began sleeping together is disputed by different sources. Some people claim they met at a gambling convention in Atlantic City before Geri even married Frank and had an instant attraction. Others say the affair began several years into the marriage when Geri was feeling particularly trapped and resentful of Frank's controlling behavior. What is absolutely certain is that by the late 1970s, Geri McGee Rosenthal was having an affair with Tony Spilotro while still married to Frank Rosenthal. And everyone in the Las Vegas underworld knew about it. This was not just ordinary marital infidelity. This was a violation of one of the mob's most sacred and strictly enforced rules. You do not mess with another made man's wife or girlfriend under any circumstances. The penalty for this violation was usually death for both parties. Tony Spilotro was a made member of the Chicago outfit, which meant he had taken a blood oath and was considered untouchable except by direct order of the boss. Frank Rosenthal, because he was Jewish, could never be formally made into the outfit. But Rosenthal was treated with the same level of respect as a capo or even an underboss because of how much money he generated for multiple mob families. Having Spilotro sleep with Rosenthal's wife was an insult that normally would have resulted in Spilotro being summoned to Chicago and executed. But for several years, the Chicago outfit looked the other way. The bosses were making too much money from the Las Vegas skim to let a sex scandal disrupt their operations. As long as Rosenthal kept the money flowing every week without fail, and as long as Spilotro did not attract too much law enforcement attention, they could maintain their personal drama without mob leadership interfering. But everything was falling apart much faster than anyone realized. Geri McGee was spiraling into severe alcoholism and drug addiction. She was abusing cocaine daily, taking prescription pills like Valium to calm down, then drinking whiskey on top of everything else. Her personality changed dramatically. She became paranoid, erratic, sometimes violent. Frank was threatening to divorce her and take full custody of their 2 children, which would leave her with nothing since everything was in Frank's name. Geri, desperate and completely unstable, knew far too much about mob operations in Las Vegas. She knew about the skim. She knew about murders that Spilotro had committed. She knew about corrupt politicians and police officers who were on the mob's payroll. She knew secrets that could send dozens of people to prison for life. And she was a drug-addicted alcoholic who could not be trusted to keep her mouth shut. Meanwhile, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was closing in on the entire Las Vegas operation. FBI agents had been investigating the casino skim for years, slowly building cases by following money trails, conducting surveillance, and flipping lower-level criminals who agreed to testify in exchange for reduced sentences. In the early 1980s, federal prosecutors finally had enough evidence to strike. They charged multiple mob leaders from Chicago, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Cleveland with conspiracy, racketeering, and tax evasion related to skimming millions of dollars from Las Vegas casinos. Joey Aiuppa, the boss of the Chicago outfit, was convicted and sentenced to 28 years in federal prison. Joey Chironi, Aiuppa's top lieutenant and underboss, also went to prison. Nick Savella, the boss of the Kansas City crime family, was convicted. Frank Ballestri, the boss of the Milwaukee crime family, was indicted. The entire Las Vegas skim operation, which had been generating hundreds of millions of dollars for organized crime since the 1960s, was exposed, destroyed, and dismantled. The Golden Goose was dead. The Chicago outfit blamed Tony Spilotro for this disaster. His high-profile crimes and his absolute inability to keep a low profile had attracted massive federal attention to Las Vegas. His hole in the wall gang had become notorious after one of his crew members, Frank Colota, was arrested for murder and decided to cooperate with authorities rather than face the death penalty. Colota admitted under oath that Spilotro had personally ordered or participated in multiple murders. He described in detail how Spilotro ran his criminal empire in Las Vegas, demanding tribute from every criminal operation in the city. He testified about the torture techniques Spilotro used to extract information from victims. This testimony was absolutely devastating because it came from someone who had been Spilotro's childhood friend and most trusted lieutenant. But the final straw, the thing that absolutely guaranteed Tony Spilotro would be killed, was the discovery that he had been skimming from the skim. Mob investigators discovered that Spilotro had been stealing cash from the casino count rooms before it could be divided among the Chicago, Milwaukee, Kansas City, and Cleveland families. He was taking money that was supposed to go to the bosses and keeping it for himself. This was the ultimate betrayal in the mob world. The outfit bosses could tolerate almost anything: violence, publicity, even affairs with other men's wives, but they could not tolerate someone stealing from them. That was absolutely unforgivable. By 1982, multiple mob families wanted Tony Spilotro dead. The Chicago outfit wanted him dead for bringing massive federal heat down on their Las Vegas operations. Milwaukee boss Frank Balistrieri wanted Spilotro dead because he blamed him for the legal problems that were destroying mob-controlled casinos. Kansas City bosses wanted him dead because the exposure had cost them millions in lost skim revenue. Even some factions within the Gambino family in New York reportedly wanted Spilotro eliminated because of disputes over various rackets. The question was not if Spilotro would be killed, but when and how. And that brings us to the evening of October 4th, 1982. Frank Rosenthal finished dinner at Tony Rama's restaurant on East Sahara Avenue in Las Vegas. He was alone, as he often was by this point because his marriage to Geri was completely destroyed and they were in the middle of bitter divorce proceedings. He walked to his 1981 Cadillac Eldorado in the parking lot, a car he had purchased brand new just months earlier. He got into the driver's seat, inserted his key into the ignition, and turned it. The explosion was massive and instantaneous. The bomb had been professionally constructed and carefully placed directly under the driver's seat for maximum lethality. Fire engulfed the entire vehicle within seconds. The heat was so intense that witnesses standing 50 feet away said they could feel it burning their faces. The blast shattered windows in the restaurant and nearby businesses. People came running from all directions, expecting to find a completely incinerated corpse inside the burning car. But Frank Rosenthal was alive. Somehow, impossibly, a metal plate that General Motors had installed under the driver's seat as a standard manufacturing feature to balance the car's weight distribution had deflected just enough of the bomb's force to prevent the full impact from killing him instantly. Rosenthal kicked open the door and crawled from the burning wreckage with his clothes on fire, screaming, "They're trying to kill me! Somebody tried to kill me!" Bystanders rushed to help him, rolling him on the ground to put out the flames. Paramedics arrived within minutes and rushed him to the hospital. Frank Rosenthal survived with burns, cuts, bruises, and severe psychological trauma. Someone had professionally attempted to assassinate him, and they had almost succeeded. But who ordered it? A witness later told police that he had seen a man bending over the rear of Rosenthal's Cadillac about an hour before the explosion, possibly placing or arming the bomb. But the witness could not provide a detailed description, and no one was ever arrested or charged. The FBI investigated and developed several theories, but they could never prove anything conclusively. Milwaukee mob boss Frank Balistrieri was considered a prime suspect. FBI wiretaps had recorded Balistrieri blaming Rosenthal for the collapse of the Las Vegas skim and saying he intended to get full satisfaction for the money he had lost. Balistrieri was known as the Mad Bomber because of his history of using explosives to intimidate or kill his enemies. He had the motive, the means, and the murderous disposition to order the hit. Kansas City mob bosses were also suspects. FBI recordings captured them calling Rosenthal crazy and out of control, and discussing the need to deal with him before he caused more problems. They blamed Rosenthal for being too flashy, too public, and too careless, which had attracted federal attention that destroyed their very profitable skim operation. Tony Spilotro himself was considered a possible suspect, either acting alone or on behalf of the Chicago outfit. Some investigators theorized that Spilotro had been ordered to kill Rosenthal, or perhaps decided on his own that Rosenthal had become too much of a liability and needed to be eliminated. The affair with Geri may have also played a role. Perhaps Spilotro wanted to get rid of Frank so he could be with Geri permanently. Or perhaps he was trying to silence Frank before Frank could reveal damaging information about Spilotro's criminal activities. Another theory involves outlaw bikers. After his separation from Frank, Geri McGee had gotten involved with a motorcycle gang crowd in Los Angeles. Some of these bikers had criminal connections and access to explosives. If Geri had asked them to kill Frank, either out of hatred or because she thought she would inherit his money, they might have attempted the bombing. Or the bikers might have acted on their own initiative if they believed Frank was a threat to Geri. The truth is, we will probably never know who ordered the car bombing. Multiple people had motives and opportunities. The mob was fracturing under federal pressure, with different factions blaming each other for the collapse of their Las Vegas empire. Frank Rosenthal survived, but his life in Las Vegas was over. He left the city about 6 months after the bombing and moved to California, then eventually to Florida, where he would spend the rest of his life. His marriage to Geri was already legally finished. Their divorce was finalized in January 1981, months before the car bomb. But Geri McGee Rosenthal would not be so lucky. She would be dead within a month of the assassination attempt on Frank. The movie Casino shows Ginger McKenna dying of a drug overdose in a dingy Los Angeles motel room, alone and completely destroyed by her addiction to cocaine and alcohol. Sharon Stone's performance in that scene is absolutely devastating and earned her a well-deserved Oscar nomination. But what the movie does not show, what it cannot show without venturing into conspiracy theory territory that might invite lawsuits, is the deeply suspicious circumstances surrounding Geri McGee's actual death and the multiple theories about who might have murdered her. On November 6, 1982, just 1 month and 2 days after the car bombing that nearly killed her ex-husband, Frank Rosenthal, Geri McGee Rosenthal was found heavily drugged and unconscious in the lobby of the Beverly Sunset Hotel on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. She was 46 years old. Hotel staff called an ambulance. Paramedics rushed her to a hospital, but she never regained consciousness. She died 3 days later, on November 9th, without ever waking up or being able to speak to investigators about what had happened to her. The Los Angeles County coroner performed an autopsy and ruled her death an accidental overdose. The toxicology report found a lethal combination of cocaine, Valium, and whiskey in her system, a deadly mix that had simply overwhelmed her heart and respiratory system. The coroner concluded that Geri had taken these substances voluntarily, probably as part of her ongoing battle with addiction, and had accidentally overdosed. Case closed. No investigation, no suspects. Just another tragic Hollywood story of someone who destroyed themselves with drugs and alcohol. But Geri's sister Barbara did not believe it was an accident for 1 second. She immediately went public, telling reporters and anyone who would listen that she believed Geri had been murdered by the same people who had tried to kill Frank Rosenthal just weeks earlier. Barbara's theory, which she maintained until her own death years later, was that Geri knew too much about the Las Vegas underworld, about mob operations, about murders and corruption, and that the mob had decided she was too dangerous to be left alive. Barbara argued that Geri was unstable, addicted to drugs, and likely to start talking to authorities if she was ever arrested, or if she got desperate enough for money. This theory actually makes a great deal of sense when you examine the facts. Geri had been intimately involved with both Frank Rosenthal and Tony Spilotro for years. She had overheard countless conversations about illegal operations. She knew about the casino skim and how it worked. She knew about specific murders that Spilotro had committed or ordered. She knew about corrupt politicians, judges, and police officers who were on the mob's payroll. She knew where bodies were buried, both literally and figuratively. And she was a cocaine-addicted alcoholic who was emotionally unstable and completely broke. From the mob's perspective, Geri McGee was exactly the kind of loose end that needed to be eliminated before she could cause serious damage. The timing of her death, just weeks after the attempt on Frank's life, seems far too convenient to be mere coincidence. If the mob was cleaning house and eliminating everyone who knew too much about the Las Vegas operation, Geri would have been very high on that list. Someone could have easily slipped her a massive dose of drugs, or a waited for her to pass out, and then left her in that hotel lobby to die. It would look exactly like an accidental overdose, especially given her well-documented history of substance abuse. Another theory is that Frank Rosenthal himself had Geri killed. This theory suggests that Frank believed Geri was somehow responsible for the car bombing, that she had told someone about his daily routine or had actively participated in planning the assassination attempt, either to get his money through life insurance or simply out of hatred. According to this theory, Frank survived the bombing, figured out that Geri was involved, and ordered her killed in retaliation. To help clear his name and show he had nothing to do with her death, Frank reportedly paid $50,000 for an independent autopsy that confirmed the coroner's finding of accidental overdose. But some investigators remain suspicious, believing that Frank's willingness to pay for this autopsy was actually evidence of guilt rather than innocence, that he was trying too hard to prove he was not involved. A third theory involves the outlaw bikers that Geri had gotten involved with in Los Angeles after her divorce. These were not nice people. They were criminals involved in drug trafficking, violence, and other illegal activities. If Geri had borrowed money from them that she could not repay, or if she had betrayed them in some business deal, or if she had simply made enemies within that world, they might have killed her. Biker gangs in the early 1980s were notorious for their violence and their willingness to murder anyone who crossed them. The truth is, we will never know for certain what happened to Geri McGee. The official cause of death remains accidental overdose of cocaine, Valium, and alcohol. The Los Angeles Police Department closed the case after a brief investigation found no evidence of foul play. No one has ever been charged with her murder. But the suspicious timing, the convenient nature of her death for multiple parties who wanted her silenced, and her sister's firm belief that it was murder all suggest that there was more to this story than a simple accidental overdose. Whether it was murder, suicide, or an actual accident, one thing is absolutely certain. Geri McGee's death was a direct result of her involvement with Frank Rosenthal and Tony Spilotro and the Las Vegas mob. The movie Casino shows Sharon Stone's character as a tragic figure destroyed by her own demons and her inability to escape her past. The reality is even sadder. Geri McGee was a beautiful, intelligent woman who was destroyed by the men around her, by Lenny Marmer, who exploited her as a teenager, by Frank Rosenthal, who tried to control every aspect of her life, by Tony Spilotro, who used her for sex while she was married to his best friend, and ultimately by a mob that saw her as a liability that needed to be eliminated. But as tragic as Geri's death was, it pales in comparison to what happened to Tony Spilotro. Because what happened to Tony and his brother Michael was so brutal, so calculated, and so horrific that even Martin Scorsese could not fully depict it on screen without making the movie unwatchable. In the film Casino, Joe Pesci's character Nicky Santoro and his brother Dominic are lured to a remote Indiana cornfield where they are ambushed by several mobsters who beat them to death with baseball bats and then bury them alive in a shallow grave. It is one of the most brutal and disturbing scenes in cinema history. Joe Pesci delivers a terrifying performance, showing absolute fear as his character realizes he has been set up and is about to be murdered. But even that horrific scene does not come close to capturing how bad the real murders actually were. On June 14th, 1986, Tony Spilotro and his younger brother Michael were told they needed to drive from Las Vegas to Chicago for an extremely important meeting. The brothers were given very specific information designed to make them believe this was going to be a positive meeting rather than a trap. Michael, who was 41 years old and had been working for Tony in various Las Vegas operations, but was not yet a made member of the Chicago outfit, was going to be formally inducted into the family. This was supposed to be one of the proudest moments of his life. Becoming a made man meant respect, protection, and power within the organization. Tony, who was 48 years old and had been a made man for decades, was supposedly going to be promoted to capo, which would give him official control over his own crew and even more status within the outfit. The brothers were naturally suspicious. Tony Spilotro had been in the mob long enough to know when something felt wrong. He knew that the Chicago bosses were angry with him for bringing too much attention to Las Vegas. He knew that Frank Collotta's testimony had damaged the outfit's operations. He knew that he had made powerful enemies. But he also knew that refusing to attend the meeting would be seen as a sign of disrespect and disloyalty, which would itself be a death sentence. So the brothers made the decision to go. They drove from Michael's home in Oak Park, a suburb of Chicago, telling their families they would return in just a few hours for a celebratory dinner. They never returned. They were never seen alive again. What actually happened to Tony and Michael Spilotro remained a mystery for nearly 21 years. The mob kept its code of silence. No one talked. No one admitted anything. The killers went free. But in 2007, during the massive family secrets trial in Chicago, one of the largest prosecutions of organized crime in American history, multiple mob turncoats finally testified about what really happened. And the truth was somehow even worse than anyone had imagined. The Spilotro brothers were picked up by Jimmy Marcello, a high-ranking member of the Chicago outfit. Marcello drove them to a house in Bensenville, Illinois. The specific address was 17W101 Bryn Mawr Avenue. The house was owned by the brother-in-law of a mobster named Lee Magnifici. When the Spilotro brothers walked through the front door and descended into the basement, they realized immediately that they were in deep, fatal trouble. There was no ceremony set up. There were no ceremonial items for a making ritual. Instead, waiting for them in that basement were approximately 10 to 12 Chicago outfit mobsters, all of whom had been specifically selected to participate in the murders. According to detailed testimony from mobster Nicholas Calabrese, who directly participated in the killings and later became a government witness, Tony Spilotro immediately understood what was about to happen. He looked around at the assembled mobsters and asked a simple question: "Can I say a prayer?" There was no verbal reply. The answer came in the form of immediate, overwhelming violence. The mobsters attacked both brothers simultaneously with coordinated precision. Calabrese testified that he personally tackled Michael Spilotro and held his legs down to prevent him from fighting back or escaping, while another mobster named James Marcello used a rope to strangle him to death. At the exact same time, other mobsters were beating Tony Spilotro with their fists and feet, punching him in the head, kicking him in the ribs and kidneys, stomping on him when he fell to the ground. Then they strangled him as well, using a rope to cut off his air supply while he struggled desperately and uselessly against overwhelming numbers. The Spilotro brothers were beaten to death with fists and feet, not baseball bats as the movie Casino depicts. The forensic pathologist who later conducted the autopsies, Dr. John Pless from Indiana University, testified in court about the specific injuries. The cause of death was officially listed as multiple head and neck injuries as a result of blunt force trauma. The brothers had injuries covering their entire bodies from their heads down to their ankles. They were viciously, systematically beaten before being strangled to death. But critically, they were not buried alive as the movie shows. They were already dead when they were buried. That is one small mercy in an otherwise completely merciless killing. After the murders were complete, the bodies were stripped down to their underwear. Their clothes, watches, jewelry, and any other identifying items were taken and destroyed separately. Then the bodies were wrapped in tarps and loaded into a vehicle. They were driven approximately 60 miles southeast of Chicago to a location near the small town of Enos, Indiana. A mobster named John Feccarotta had been given the specific task of disposing of the bodies. He and several other men dug a grave in a cornfield and buried the Spilotro brothers together. The grave was only 5 feet deep, shallow enough that it would eventually be discovered, but deep enough that the bodies would not be immediately visible. The brothers' bodies were stacked on top of each other in the grave, a final indignity in death. The corn growing in that field in mid-June was only about 4 inches high at that point in the season, nowhere near tall enough to hide the freshly turned earth. 9 days later, on June 22, 1986, a farmer named Michael Kins was plowing his cornfield when he noticed an area of freshly turned soil that looked suspicious. Thinking that a poacher might have illegally killed a deer and buried it to hide the evidence, Kins called Indiana Department of Natural Resources officers. When they arrived and started digging to see what had been buried, they did not find a deer. They found 2 human bodies stacked on top of each other, badly decomposed from 9 days in a shallow grave during warm summer weather, wearing only underwear. The bodies were identified through dental records as Tony and Michael Spilotro. The murders made national headlines. Everyone knew who Tony Spilotro was. The FBI had been investigating him for years, and his name had come up repeatedly in the Las Vegas casino skim trials. The discovery of his body, brutally murdered and buried in a cornfield, marked the absolute end of the Chicago outfit's control of Las Vegas. The era of mob-controlled casinos was officially over. The new generation of corporate ownership was taking over the Strip, legitimate businesses like MGM and Caesars, entertainment that had no connection to organized crime and no tolerance for the kind of violence and corruption that had defined Las Vegas for 40 years. Frank Rosenthal outlived everyone. After leaving Las Vegas in 1983, about 6 months after surviving the car bombing, he moved first to Laguna Niguel in Southern California, and later to Boca Raton, Florida, and finally to Miami Beach, where he would spend the final decades of his life. In 1988, the Nevada Gaming Commission officially placed him in the Black Book, the list of people permanently banned from entering any casino in the state of Nevada for life. Rosenthal challenged this ban in court, hiring attorney Oscar Goodman, who would later become the mayor of Las Vegas. But Rosenthal lost his legal appeals and remained in the Black Book, banned from Nevada casinos until his death. In Florida, Rosenthal opened and ran a sports bar called Crocs that became moderately successful. He operated several sports betting websites, taking advantage of the new internet gambling industry. He consulted for various offshore sports betting companies in the Caribbean and Central America, sharing his decades of expertise on how to set odds, manage risk, and maximize profits. He gave occasional interviews about his time in Las Vegas, always portraying himself as a legitimate businessman who had been unfairly targeted by corrupt regulators and law enforcement. And he remained extremely bitter about Martin Scorsese's film Casino, which was released in 1995 and was based largely on Rosenthal's life story. Rosenthal had consulted on the movie and the Nicholas Pileggi book it was based on, but he strongly objected to many aspects of the final product. He particularly hated the portrayal of his relationship with Geri, which he believed made him look weak and foolish, and he objected to how the film depicted his friendship with Tony Spilotro, which he insisted was never as close as the movie suggested. On October 13, 2008, Frank Rosenthal died of an apparent heart attack at his Miami Beach home. He was 79 years old. His death received surprisingly little media attention, considering how famous he had once been. But shortly after his death, the FBI revealed something absolutely shocking that had been kept secret for years, possibly decades. Frank Rosenthal had been an FBI informant. For an unknown period of time, Rosenthal had been secretly providing information to federal authorities about organized crime operations in Las Vegas, Chicago, and elsewhere. The FBI released redacted documents showing that Rosenthal had met with agents and provided intelligence about mob activities. This revelation completely stunned everyone who had known Rosenthal. He had always portrayed himself publicly as someone who lived by the mob's code of omerta, the code of silence that forbids cooperation with law, enforcement under any circumstances. He had presented himself as loyal to his mob associates, someone who would never rat or testify, even when facing prison time. But apparently, all of that was a lie. Rosenthal had been cooperating with the FBI, which means he had been betraying the very people who had made him wealthy and powerful. This raises deeply disturbing questions about the car bombing. If Rosenthal was already an FBI informant in 1982, did the mob somehow know or suspect this? Is that the real reason they tried to kill him? The official FBI line is that Rosenthal only began cooperating after surviving the assassination attempt, that the bombing scared him so badly that he decided to trade information for federal protection. But some investigators believe Rosenthal may have been providing information to the FBI for years before the bombing, and that someone in the mob discovered this betrayal and ordered him killed. We may never know the complete truth because Rosenthal took his secrets to the grave, and the FBI has not released all the relevant documents. What we do know with absolute certainty is that everyone directly involved in the real casino story ended up dead, destroyed, imprisoned, or psychologically traumatized. Geri McGee died at age 46 from what was officially ruled an accidental drug overdose, but may very well have been murder. Tony Spilotro and his brother Michael were brutally beaten and strangled to death in a Chicago basement and buried in an Indiana cornfield. Jay Vandermark, who ran the actual skimming operation for Rosenthal, disappeared in 1976 and was never found. He was almost certainly murdered by the mob, and his body disposed of in a way that prevented it from ever being recovered. Alan Glick, the frontman who officially owned the Argent casinos, testified against the mob in multiple trials and entered the Federal Witness Protection Program, where he lived under an assumed identity for the rest of his life. Frank Colota, Spilotro's childhood friend and most trusted lieutenant, also became a government witness and spent decades looking over his shoulder, knowing that there was a price on his head. He died in 2020 at age 81, having never been able to live a normal life after betraying the mob. The Chicago outfit bosses who ordered the Spilotro murders also suffered. Joey Ayupa died in federal prison in 1997 at age 89, having served 11 years of his 28-year sentence for racketeering. Joey Chironi died in prison in 1996 at age 82. The mobsters who actually committed the murders were eventually caught and convicted during the massive family secrets trial in 2007. Most of them receive life sentences and will die in federal prison. But the darkest truth about the real casino story, the truth that even Martin Scorsese's brilliant and unflinching film could not fully convey, is not about individual deaths or prison sentences. It is about the complete systemic corruption of an entire American city for more than 40 years. From the late 1940s through the mid-1980s, organized crime families from Chicago, Kansas City, Milwaukee, Cleveland, and other cities controlled major Las Vegas casinos. They skimmed billions of dollars in unreported cash. They corrupted law enforcement at every level, local police, county sheriffs, state gaming regulators, even some federal officials. They bribed politicians to ensure favorable legislation. They intimidated and murdered anyone who threatened their operations. They used violence and the threat of violence to maintain absolute control over one of America's premier tourist destinations. And they did it all in plain sight, hidden only by layers of front companies, corrupt unions, and complicit officials who looked the other way in exchange for money and favors. The Nevada Gaming Control Board knew perfectly well that the mob controlled these casinos, but for decades they were powerless or unwilling to stop it. The FBI knew but had limited jurisdiction in Nevada and faced resistance from local law enforcement. Politicians took campaign contributions from casino owners and labor unions that were secretly controlled by organized crime. The entire system was rotten from top to bottom, and it took decades of painstaking investigation, multiple federal trials, and the cooperation of mob turncoats before the corruption could finally be exposed and dismantled. Frank Rosenthal, Geri McGee, Tony Spilotro, and all the others who lived through this era are gone now. Las Vegas has completely transformed itself. The casinos are now owned by massive publicly traded corporations like MGM Resorts, Caesars Entertainment, and Wynn Resorts. The days of mob control are over. The city aggressively markets itself as family-friendly entertainment, a place where people can bring their children to see spectacular shows and stay in themed hotels that look like castles or pyramids or the New York skyline. The Strip is safe, regulated, and monitored by sophisticated security systems and professional law enforcement. But underneath all that modern glitz and glamour, the blood and betrayal of the mob era remain, buried like the Spilotro brothers in that Indiana cornfield, hidden from tourists and casual observers, but never truly gone. The ghosts of Frank Rosenthal, Geri McGee, Tony Spilotro, and countless others still haunt Las Vegas. Their story is a reminder that behind every American success story, there might be oceans of unreported cash, systematic corruption, and bodies buried in unmarked graves. The real casino story is not entertainment. It is a cautionary tale about what happens when organized crime is allowed to operate with impunity for decades, and about how everyone involved, criminals and victims alike, eventually pays the price. The movie Casino is a cinematic masterpiece. Robert De Niro, Sharon Stone, and Joe Pesci all delivered career-defining performances. Martin Scorsese's direction is brilliant. The cinematography, the editing, the soundtrack, everything about the film is exceptional. But it is still Hollywood. It is still fiction based on truth rather than the actual truth itself. The real story, the systematic torture, the suspicious deaths that may have been murders, the complete corruption of an entire city, the FBI informant revelation that came after Frank Rosenthal's death, is so much darker than any movie could possibly show. If you want more true crime stories that go deeper than Hollywood ever could, that expose the real violence and real corruption that lurks beneath famous stories, that show you the darkness that movies can only hint at, subscribe to the Syndicate Files right now. We dig deeper than anyone else to bring you the truth that changes how you see history. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and do not miss our next investigation into the crimes that shaped America. Drop a comment below. Did you realize how much darker the real Casino story was compared to the movie? Does knowing the truth change how you see the film? Share this video with someone who thinks Martin Scorsese showed them everything. The Syndicate Files, where we reveal the truths that Hollywood buries.